Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Welcome to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. I'm Jean Till, and on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Patricia Pintado Murphy, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein.
So wonderful to have Dr. Pintado with us, but maybe just talk a little bit about, what's before us in the Universal Church. Our pastor has been called to God, Pope Francis, Easter Monday, and, his the yoke of suffering that he bore in recent months, and we thought he was making and emerging from all of that. But putting himself out there on Sunday and all that, his both the yoke of office, but also his natural inclinations to be with the people, to celebrate the Easter, and to manifest himself as the Vicar of Christ in that last victory lap. It turned out, he wasn't gloating or exalting himself, but he was lifting before us the one who is risen indeed, and whom we continue to celebrate in this octave, even as that mingling of joy and suffering. And he touched on that so poignantly, I thought, in his message, De Lexit Nos, about how death itself does not represent the terminus, and so by virtue of our baptisms are in conquerable hope that we have that is all of this. So both his message, on Spes non confundit, hope does not disappoint. So he's left us a rich legacy and I think a charge just by his example in life and, of course, his message. Yes, go ahead, Jean.
We have a Mass today. If you're listening on Saturday, April 26th, we are having a memorial Mass for Pope Francis at the Basilica of St. John at 10 o'clock. So you can listen to the whole show and then buzz over to the Basilica. In your vehicle, on the way to Basilica.
And gather with the Church of Des Moines. The Basilica will be there. And it's just an opportunity. Yes, in the octave of Easter, the readings and everything is precedence. But though we do not mention him in the Eucharistic prayer, as we in this interim period, we'll be mentioning him and thanking God and also commending him to God, because we're all in need of purification. We all need divine mercy at every phase of the way, including after death.
And by the way, Basilica will be live streaming it on their Facebook page. So for those that can't make it there by 10 o'clock, you can still participate.
Jean, you are one who knows, so you are a woman in touch with everything. So again, the grace of the week, being with the St. John Norwalk confirmation class, Assumption Granger, celebrating the Mercy College Health Science graduation. We commend to God Father Mike Berner, who was buried on Wednesday from St. Patrick, Council Bluffs, Deacon Ed Pantalone from St. Pius X the day after. And we look forward to this evening, after the Mass at the Basilica, to being with the young people of Sacred Heart Baird, St. Cecilia Panora, and St. Mary Guthrie Center for their confirmation. And then the following day at St. Patrick, Mo Valley, and St. Anne Logan, and St. Michael in Harlan. So the oils are flowing in this
and
way.
In your spare time.
Yeah, so many other things. Dr. Pintado, welcome. Thank you to Making It Personal. Our connection goes way back as we were in doctoral studies together. You knew me as a anxious younger priest trying to keep his head above water in a doctoral program of further studies, and you were a great source of support to me and inspiration in who you are. So now your vocation has carried you to St. Mary of the Lake Seminary at Mundelein, Illinois, where you teach seminarians. You've gone on for further studies in theology beyond your terminal degree in philosophy, where you study Kant and an interesting life path. You're a native of the Canary Islands, University of Navarra. So you identify yourself by nationality originally as a Spaniard, but now an American citizen?
Actually, yesterday I got a letter from my consulate. I'm officially, have two nationalities. Spain has to accept that you became an American and you keep the Spanish, you request to keep the Spanish nationality. So
wonderful.
Congratulations.
I'm so happy for you. Wow, that's tremendous. So you can have it both ways once in a while in life. So wonderful. And I'm married to Dr. Bill Murphy, a moral theologian in his own right. So I can only imagine the table conversations that you two have, but he's a delightful fellow. So your vocation as well. Dr. Pintado, and I will call you Patricia on occasion since we do know each other well. We'll have to take a pause because I've expounded too much here. So.
Well, when we return, we will be visiting with Dr. Patricia Pintado Murphy, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. And on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Patricia Pintado, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein.
So, Dr. Pintado, Patricia, since I've known you, you're one very familiar kind of how the church manifests itself in the whole European milieu and the civilization and culture that's there. As a Spaniard, American, but also kind of familiar with the Latin culture. That day in 2013 when Jorge Mario Bergoglio stepped out on the loggia and, Pope Francis and greeted us, Buonasera. What was your reaction as one who kind of looked, with an Argentinian Pope? What was your sense now as the Pope, the Church now would draw her shepherd from Latin America?
Well, it was probably also a recognition of the huge presence of the Catholic Church in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly not only Latin America, that was traditionally the whole continent Catholic, but also, in years to come, we'll notice a similar growth in Africa and Asia. So the Church is, at least from the point of view of demographic, changing rapidly. So for me, it was simply a manifestation of the passing of one generation to the other, where Europe used to be the roots and the foundation of the Catholic Church after the Holy Land. And now it's up to the new countries after colonization that kept their faith and seem to have a very vibrant church.
And Pope Francis has carried this consciousness throughout his papacy in terms of who he's recognizing, identifying, and calling to the rank of cardinal, in that he's established so many in local churches that had never before had a cardinal as archbishop as their shepherd. Do you think this is something he brought as part of his appreciation for where's the freshness and the joy of the gospel exploding?
I think his main influence or inspiration for that is not only his own experience, but following in the footsteps of Paul VI, who in Populorum Progressio and in other of his documents was really opening up the view to this universality of the Church. And he was the one also experiencing firsthand how new countries were seeking independence in the post-World War II era, and therefore there he saw an opportunity of looking at new churches and at the phenomenon of inculturation, and therefore quite creative ways of embodying Catholicism in this new essentially sphere of evangelization for the Church, because we were also very preoccupied by the secularization in Europe and North America, while, he gave us hope by looking at all this springtime in the new created countries after decolonization. And that was probably something that Paul VI particularly talked about, but in the case of Pope Francis, he made it a more visible reality by also, naming cardinals from all these northerners. For us, it may be obscure places, but it was a beautiful recognition of the presence of the Church all over the world.
Marvelously laid out. He himself, a Jesuit provincial, ultimately called to become a bishop, but himself, unlike his predecessors, was not an actual participant in the Second Vatican Council. Obviously, his imbibing of the message and the dispositions of Paul VI, following upon the council, did he see himself as taking up that evangelical orientation as an expression of the council? Did he think that it was part of his role as shepherd to interpret the council, or was that something he left to others as theologians and maybe other bishops of the Church?
I think he recognized all the work of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI as, intellectuals or cardinals who were involved in the Second Vatican Council. And for him, it was a question more of witnessing and therefore embodying in real life all those great ideals that John Paul II and also Benedict explained so beautifully. And he didn't mean to, rewrite history or come up with an original reinterpretation. He just wanted us to really look deeper into what the council meant and how is it supposed to be manifested even more clearly, because nowadays people have, short attention span and may have thought of the council as something past. And instead, it's still in the making. It's not, from what we know of church history, the embodiment of what a council proposes takes a long time. Even if you go back to Trent, you realize some of the countries like France took a long time to embrace and accept some of the teachings of the Council of Trent. So I don't think we are, different just because we are in a contemporary, faster society. It takes time. And he also acknowledged that, together with John Paul II and Benedict, that it's at times, trial and error, meaning we don't necessarily always clearly aware of what the council taught, because there's so many opposing interpretations that particularly at the beginning of the implementation of the council teachings, there may have been confusion. So we're still in that phase where we need to revisit and read and study the teachings of the council to understand what makes the church and where the church is headed.
Yeah. Over and against perhaps those who would say we need to call a Vatican III in that way. No, we need to continue to absorb what the Holy Spirit has done and how it's instructing and then inspiring us, which will take centuries to unfold in that way. We won't get caught up in the kind of internal conversations, debates about continuity or discontinuity, but it seems like you're making the case for continuity among the succession of papacies, John Paul.
That's not exactly what Benedict said in his famous statement. In the United States, unfortunately, his famous statement about what the hermeneutic of the council, or how to interpret the council, the full sentence is reform and renewal with some acts of continuity and discontinuity. But, we simplify things through the media, and it looks like, it's either continuity on one side or rupture and discontinuity in the other. And I think Benedict was much more nuanced, because in the famous speech he gave in 2005, he went on to explain why certain documents of the council, particularly the ones on religious freedom, or Nostratate, all the relationships with other religions or with the Jews or with our brother Protestants, all that was in part had aspects of novelty. That so much so that at one point when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, he used to say the council, some documents of the council are a counter-syllabus. So he was stating that it was not necessarily in continuity with the syllabus of errors of Pius IX. So again, he calls it reform and renewal, which entails some aspects of change and some aspects of continuity. But he never would use, obviously, the term rupture.
Right. And so Francis carrying that forward with that same degree of distinctions and, embracing that. You talk about the ecumenical interfaith. It's something that Francis has really gone, meeting with grand imams and others, traveling to Iraq, friendship with Orthodox Patriarch, and signing certain kind of common statements that were there as brothers and sisters. How do you see that legacy being part of what we need to appreciate and yet also a goad and stimulus for us?
I think, first of all, to really understand him, you have to carefully study Evangelii Gaudium. It's probably all there in his first statement. And then take into account the historical background that in Latin America that leads him to be particularly interested in Catholic social doctrine. And you can see that in writings like Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. And I would say that, he is reinvigorating some of the themes of Gaudium et Spes, which means, particularly for the United States, it has been challenging because following Gaudium et Spes, he is very much interested in establish a dialogue with the world, including the secular world. And the language of Gaudium et Spes, it's not the language of hostility. But because of trends, more aggressive trends of secularism, particularly in the United States, we settle very much for the style of the cultural wars. And I have to sometimes, here I am talking like a European or a non-American. I have to remind my beloved Americans, listen, the whole church is not engulfed in cultural wars like we have here. The church is much bigger than this, and in other places they really have other, concerns. And he wanted to move. It was a challenge for us because he wanted to open us up to say, we are the outliers right now. So the question is, do you want to evangelize in the peripheries? In our case, peripheries meant the people that have critical or hostile views of the church. How can we try to understand them instead of looking at them, according to him, in a very unchristian way, as primarily enemies? He wanted to move away from that and emphasize, again, following the footsteps of Paul VI, the issue of dialogue, because he also was very aware that we are not just trying to be open and attentive to those who have no faith, but I think, and this is very much my opinion, so I could be wrong, that he was very keen on all those who had been Catholic. Mm-hmm. And instead of just saying, well, they chose the wrong side, they chose to be secular, they chose to, forget the faith, he wanted to understand how can we make the church, be attentive to your concerns, or what let you be alienated from the church. He wanted to essentially learn from them in order for us to also be better in evangelizing those who had been among our flock.
Thank you. Points well taken, Patricia. A little bit of a provocative question based on what you've just been reflecting with us about, to that overture to the people who we would describe maybe as secular, that they identify with the world, maybe more than the inbreaking of God's reign and dispensation, which is part of his appeal. It's such a massive popular appeal. Have there been at times, that appropriation, you offered me a friendly amendment that's saying, with Benedict, it's more subtle in terms of continuity and discontinuity. The forces of secularism, was there at times an appropriation, a latching on to certain things that Francis would say, whether in his formal messages or casual comments that he makes, that maybe reduced Francis in some way and, appropriate him for their own agenda, their own, worldview?
Well, people may have forgotten how the media also treated Benedict XVI. So, there is always the temptation of looking at the work of each Holy Father through the lens of our own preferences. So I would say in front of every single Holy Father, particularly now that we are bombarded with not many reliable sources on the Internet, and we unfortunately may choose those sites that seem to reinforce our impressions or our opinions, I would say we should do examination of conscience and discern, why don't I read Benedict first, or why don't I read Francis first before I read what the media says, because that's going to taint my encounter with the text or my encounter with the news, because you're going to be paying attention to somebody reinterpreting or somebody reacting, somebody being scandalized, and that it's not a fair assessment of what he may have said or meant.
So that is exactly what you're doing with seminarians who you're helping to form on the intellectual side of things. And we're coming up about 45 seconds away from a break here, so this may carry over. But that sense that we're going to read the texts of Francis. We're not going to just accept a particular narrative or lens that is maybe imposed upon him. And so seminarians maybe come with their own kind of dispositions, their own biases, their own kind of blind spots when it comes to Francis. And you kind of guide them so that we get the real man and the real message. Is that not true?
True. I mean, after the break, we can go into some techniques I have in class that so far have worked very well, because I have 2 classes on Pope Francis, one for seminarians and another one for laity.
Wow, wonderful. We look forward to that. There's our teaser for our audience. Yeah. Okay.
We will be back shortly with Dr. Patricia Pintado, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Mary of the Lake in Medellin. And if you're listening to the show this Saturday, April 26th, there is a memorial mass being celebrated at the Basilica of St. John in Des Moines at 10 o'clock. So you still have time to get there, or you can watch it as it live streams on Facebook. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen.
So the evangelical mission, his statement on he loved us, mission is a radiation of the love of the heart of Christ, and to speak of Christ by witness or word, this dynamism of love, and how Christ asks us never to be ashamed to tell others with all discretion and respect about your friendship with him. How, and then in your engagement with seminarians and then with other lay folks, were you drawing them into the actual message of the man?
I realized we needed to start from the ground up. In other words, where does he come from? And not just him as a Jesuit in Argentina, but broader. What's the history of the Catholic Church in Latin America, particularly under Spanish colonial rule? After all, there were 300 years there. And essentially the experience of the Church in Latin America is completely different from the USA, because it is a real cultural phenomenon that shapes the whole continent, which was not the case with us. And second, because the Church was very much inserted in the political and social fabric of the countries. And one way to explain that, given that he's a Jesuit, is I would encourage everybody to watch this old movie called The Mission, where you can see how the Jesuits evangelize in a very particular way the indigenous people. And then, of course, he belongs to the generation of the famous meetings of the bishops' conferences of Latin America and the Caribbean called SELAM, where, became at some point a polemic setting because of the emergence in the 60s and 70s of liberation theology. And as a Jesuit provincial from the beginning, Father Bergoglio, distanced himself from the activism or the revolutionary involvement of some Jesuits. And he definitely wanted to go back to the basic spirituality of the Jesuits and how you are a witness more than just a political activist.
You mentioned that, and that was a neuralgic point, obviously, for John Paul II, which interpretation, and my own experience traveling to Peru and Lima and engaging in the documents and some of the faculty at the Catholic University there. In itself, in its essence, liberation theology is very consonant with the gospel, but it's this political dimension and the recourse to violence, which is inimical to the gospel.
And it's worth reading for Bergoglio and many other cardinals. It was very eye-opening to see how Benedict XVI, when I would recommend to everybody for him to read, because I get a little tired of the opposing of Benedict versus Francis, as if we are running for some sort of political primary. Benedict, when he went to the Aparecida meeting where with all the cardinals and bishops of Latin America, he gave a wonderful speech, and you can see in the language he uses that he is embracing important aspects of liberation theology, because he is aware that one of the obstacles for the faith is the social and political and economic struggles of the people of God, which 80% of the Catholics in Latin America are more or less poor. Mm-hmm. And that will affect the way to live out the faith.
Yeah, we're on the home stretch of the last minute. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring you back, Patricia, at some point here. But and so for the seminarians and others, is there I can't just accept the narrative spin that's been given to me.
Yep.
Okay. Very simple.
I highly recommend history, and then I would also recommend, as you mentioned at some point, the Borghese books to understand the intellectual roots that he relies on. But I would say the lasting legacy for him is his caring not only for the poor, but what would be called, I would summarize him as a Pope of mercy and a Pope of hope, embodied through his compassion and tenderness towards every single person, particularly those in need, as he liked to call it, the field hospital.
Yes, and those on the peripheries. There are many more questions, but I'll let you have the last word, Dr. Pintado. Thank you very much for gracing us today. So blessings to you throughout this Easter season.
Yep, and to be continued. Happy Easter.
Thank you. This has been another edition.
Good work, Bishop.
This has been another edition of Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. Thank you to our guest and to all of our listeners in Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Illinois, or wherever you may be listening to the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
You can hear Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen every week on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.